We're going to dive deep into the topic around the impact of sexual activity and what it has on strength training and sports performance, and we're going to start right now. What's up, everybody? It's Dane Miller from GarageStrength.com, and if this is your first time to the channel and you're interested in becoming an absolute athletic freak, you want to be explosive, you want to get stronger, you want to run faster, make sure that you like, you subscribe, and you ring that notification bell so we can help you become a champion. So at Garage Strength, we've developed a ton of world-class athletes in the realm of freestyle wrestling, in the realm of track and field, discus throwing, shot putting, in the world of Olympic weightlifting. We've had athletes at the world championship level in all three of those different sports. And oftentimes, the men that we've developed tend to be a little bit more aggressive. They tend to be a little bit more ornery. They tend to be a little bit more edgy, and they like to ask that question, Dane, what will sex do to my strength gains? Can sexual activity have a negative impact on my sports performance? And fortunately for us, Gerald Zavorsky has done a bunch of different studies around sexual activity and its impact on sports performance, and we're going to dive deep into the research he did with 10 married men and the impact that sports performance sustained after they partook in sexual activity. So what exactly was Zavorsky studying? Okay, so he had 10 different married men. They were all involved in monogamous relationships. And so these 10 men on average were about 28 years of age, plus or minus 7 years. So a pretty big pool that he was pulling from. And they all wanted to see, by signing this form of consent, what sexual activity had on their impact of sports performance or power output, of oxygen uptake, of all these different tests that we'll cover later on. And so the way he set up this test is he constructed 3 different days of testing. They had a familiarization day. So this is the day that all of the subjects became familiar with the tests. So they learned the 6 different tests, they executed them, and they understood what they were going to be doing. Then they got tested after 5 days of abstinence from an orgasm. So there was no petting, as it says in the document, there was no orgasm from masturbation, and there was no orgasm from sexual activity for 5 days. Then they got tested after that 5 days of abstinence. So they got tested on the 6 tests, which we will cover. Then finally, they had sexual activity, and within 24 hours after the sexual activity, they got tested again. So by the 3rd test, they were very familiar with the tests. So now we're gonna go into those 6 specific tests to see what those tests are, and then we're gonna learn what was the impact that sex had on those tests long term. So that test number 1 was a maximal grip strength. So they used a dynamometer, which is an apparatus that you can squeeze as rapidly as possible. And what they did is they instructed the individuals to place their dominant hand on the table and squeeze 3 times. Okay, so during these tests, they would squeeze it 3 times, they would take the average of those 3 tests, and that would be the specific result. These are pretty simple to do, they're very accurate. They also show you how well someone is operating from a neurological perspective. How healthy people tend to be is often associated with a good, strong grip strength test. Dynamometers are pretty cheap, they're pretty fun to play with as well. So that was that first test. The second test, they had a balance board, which is they put individuals on a little pendulum type setting, and they would balance back and forth. And if there was a 10-degree fluctuation, they had an electronic apparatus that would monitor how long they would be outside of 10 degrees of fluctuation. And this test was done over 30 seconds. So it could show where the stability was and how long they were unstable at certain degrees. Again, they were doing this 3 different times, so the balance board test was done 3 specific times, and then they would take the average. That 3rd test is the side step agility. So this was something that was developed by Egren, and it was called the Egren side step test. So basically you would have 5 pieces of tape, and they would be 3 feet apart. And the individual would start, and they would shuffle back and forth for the allotted time, and then They were not allowed to move laterally, crossing over. Everything had to be based off of a side shuffle. Based off of the test protocols, they would be tested 3 times, and then the average was taken off of that Egren sidestep test. That 4th test would be a computerized reaction time. So this is something that reminds me of when we were in high school and you're sitting there playing with a keyboard. But these individuals would sit down, they'd have headphones on, there'd be an auditory cue. So there would be a ding, and as soon as you would hear that cue, you would hit the space bar as quickly as possible. So essentially what this is testing is how quickly you hear and then how quickly you go from hearing to a motor proposition. So this can be very similar to a test, a reaction-based test that you might see sprinters coming off the line. How fast do they hear the gun and then have that motor proposition to begin the drive phase? So that's very applicable to sports performance, although it seems very simple. It's very applicable because of the reaction time. So that 5th test that they're going to go into was the Kalaman power test. So this is a test that was testing the power development of their lower extremities, of their legs. So in this specific test, it's going to be lasting less than 5 seconds. The individuals are going to start about 6 meters away from the steps. They're going to run into the steps, or slightly run, not full speed, into the steps. And then they would jump up the steps, and they would have to land on the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th step before jumping to the 12th and final step. And the key here is that the 3rd, 6th, and 9th steps is where they have to land, okay? But the measurement, the power output would be on the 3rd step and on the 9th step. So how well did they react to that power development after the walk up, so that 3rd landing, and how well were they able to continue that power development into that 9th step that they were landing on? So how well were they able to react, coordinate, and then finish their jump? So this is a pretty interesting test because you can see how they react, what their speed is. It's similar to a double leg triple jump or a double leg bounds, anything along these lines. It's a pretty accurate test. It's going to show you how effective they are as athletes. And then that final 6th test is going to be more about maximal oxygen uptake. So they put these guys on treadmills. They walked at about 3.5 miles per hour for a minute, and then they slowly increased that to 6.5 miles per hour. And then every minute they would increase the grade of the treadmill by 1%. So throughout that entire test, they were checking what was the perceived rate of exhaustion. Then they were looking at what was the oxygen uptake. And ultimately they were coming back to what was the maximal heart rate. So if you can think about maximal heart rate, a very generalized way of understanding maximal heart rate is taking number 220 and subtracting your age from 220, and that should be about where your maximal heart rate is. This test can show us what type of cardiovascular form these individuals were in when they do it prior to actually partaking in sexual activity, and then after sexual activity, what kind of response did we end up seeing? It's a pretty decent test if we're thinking more about along the lines of endurance. And one of the big things here is that there was almost a direct correlation between individuals that had a higher oxygen uptake tended to have a little bit lower score on the power test, meaning they produce a little bit less force, and then vice versa. Just showing what I believe is basically accurate is that individuals that are more power-based might have a little bit less endurance. Individuals that have a little more endurance might be a little bit lower on the spectrum of power output, which is pretty standard within the realm of sports performance. But ultimately, Zavorsky wanted to see, did any of these factors change after sexual activity? So now let's go into what actually happens when we have an orgasm. When men have orgasms, what happens? We know that testosterone doesn't really change. We know that prior to an orgasm, the catecholamines, noradrenaline and adrenaline are going up. Our heart rate is going up. We know after an orgasm occurs, we know that prolactin skyrockets. It goes very high. So prolactin suppresses the need or the urge for a male to want to have sex again, which is why for about 10 to 15 minutes after men orgasm, they're not really interested in sex. They're having this euphoric experience. They're having this great experience, and that's why men enjoy having sex, is because they've had this great huge dump in dopamine. So when our heart rate shoots up and when our adrenaline is skyrocketing and our noradrenaline is skyrocketing, our dopamine is going off the charts. And then we have this dopamine dump, and that's also equated to our orgasm. Our testosterone levels are not really changing at all, but prolactin skyrockets, then it slowly drops off about 15 minutes after orgasm, and our dopamine levels resume to being about normal about 15 to 20 minutes after orgasm. So we know that's what happens from orgasms, but what does that impact from physical performance? And that's really what this study was about, is how does that hormonal interaction impact sports performance? So if we can go back to that first test, that maximal grip test, and even the balance board, the second test, right? What ended up happening? There was no change prior to sexual activity to after sexual activity. There was almost no change at all. Now if we go into that sidestep test, or even the Kalaman power output test, and using that computerized reaction time, I think that's where I was most interested in, is that I wanted to see if prolactin had a negative impact on our reaction time, on our shuffling, on the Kalaman power test, because after you have sex and you experience an orgasm, you tend to be fatigued. Now, there is a sleep period before these tests, and what ends up happening is it shows us there was no negative or positive change on the outcome of the performance in these 10 married men. And then finally, when we're talking about the endurance test, again, no negative or positive change on the direct impact on sports performance. So what that tells us is that if you have sexual activity the night before a competition or the night before training, you're likely not going to experience a negative or positive benefit from that sexual activity, from that orgasm, as long as you're males, right? Regarding male specifically. However, I do believe if there's a much more acute time, so if we have a sexual activity or a sexual experience, and then within an hour, we go to perform some physical task or physical competition, there might be a negative response because of that increase in prolactin. Now, this has not been shown in research, it has not been proven, but it's something that the field can start to look into, is where is that time frame? And I believe that time frame is probably about 1 to 2 hours is where you'll see that negative impact. And then we can start to say, in reality, there is no negative or positive impact from sexual activity as long as there's a night shift, there's a period of sleep heading into that next day. So if you want more information about sexual activity and its impact on performance, you can click on this video right here. Until next time, guys, peace.